Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
All right. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Out Front. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Getting a few things ready for the day here. All right. I think we're all good. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the latest indicator of American weakness, especially how that's being seen and taken by observers abroad, i.e. Russia and China. We're also going to get into the latest threat from, this is interesting now, from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Before we get started, a few people have been asking about show notes, if they can get sources and quotes and all this stuff that I provide every day. And the answer is yes, you will. Yes, you can. I'm just literally just going to copy and paste all my show notes for the day and put that over on the Forward Observer website for subscribers. So if you want to support this show, get access to my daily show write-ups, then you can do that by subscribing for just $10 a month over at forwardobserver.com/subscribe. And you'll also be able to get access to our daily early warning report, a global intelligence brief that comes out every morning. All right, we're going to get into today's shout down of the day. That goes out to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. She was speaking at an Atlantic Council event this morning where she asked for China's help in bringing an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. She said, quote, "The world's attitude towards China and its willingness to embrace further economic integration may be affected by China's reaction." Wow, what a sentence. In essence, she's saying China's standing in the world may be determined by their ability to bring about an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. She continues, "The future of our international order, both for peace and security, and both for peaceful security and economic prosperity, is at stake. And let's be clear, the unified coalition," she's talking about U.S.-led sanctions, the West, all these countries that are currently putting sanctions on Russia. And by the way, I think more sanctions are on the way. This unified coalition will not be indifferent to actions that undermine the sanctions we've put in place. Basically, she is telling India, China, other countries, Brazil, other countries that have not gone along with these U.S.-led sanctions. She's essentially warning them here that they need to get with the program. That's what she says. So if this is any indication of the strength of the American empire, our Treasury Secretary is asking China for help in bringing about a peaceful conclusion to the Russia-Ukraine war. In essence, U.S. officials are asking China to do something that they themselves cannot do. I think that's an important indicator. China gets that message loud and clear. As a matter of fact, the Chinese foreign ministry spokesdude talked about that in today's press briefing over there. This is an important point because was it yesterday, previous weeks, I talked about the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, and that was the end of the British Empire period. That a lot of people say the British Empire was waning or ended far beyond that. I think it was in 1956 with this thing. And if we go back to, 5 to 10, 20 plus years from now, we're going to look back on February to April, May, however long this conflict lasts, probably months, if I had to guess. Before I get there, I don't know how long this conflict's going to last. I just saw where both the Ukrainians and Russians came out and said, yeah, peace talks are pretty much cooked because we're not making any progress. And now instead of meeting face to face, they're happening online, apparently. So I know U.S. intelligence officials have allegedly said the Russians are trying to get out of there, or trying to bring about an end to the conflict. Was it May 9th on Russian Victory Day? I don't know what to make of that. Obviously, don't see the same intelligence that they do. But this thing could last for weeks or or longer, regardless of how long it lasts, in 5 to 10, 20 years, we're going to look back on this period of time and go, yeah, that is a turning point for the American empire, specifically what's happening to the US led rules based international order and what's going on with the dollar based global trade system, the dollar as the world reserve currency right now. This is especially true because we go back to yesterday's program and it talks about BRICS, how China is weaponizing BRICS. Things are going to escalate on this front this year because China has leadership, the committee leadership of the BRICS countries. And I read you literally directly from these Chinese government documents yesterday about what their strategy is. And so what we're seeing here is a landmark time here for the end of the American empire, I think. And I do expect the American empire to end. All empires do. This is nothing groundbreaking. You can read 15 minutes of history and realize this. In terms of when this could happen, you know, I'm still very concerned about 2024 elections. Someone's commented on this show the other day that he thinks 22 is going to be the end, the 2022 elections. I don't see that. I think things will certainly escalate. I think the 2022 elections this November are going to give people on both sides kind of a sense of urgency because it's going to, I mean, you think there's political gridlock now. Just wait until the Republicans are back in charge of the House and Senate. And by the way, I am not carrying water for Republicans. They're going to get in there and do the bare minimum. You know, they're going to become the party of no and stop all the things that Biden wants to do. And, you know, it wasn't really a prediction, but, you know, some of these members of Congress have talked about launching kind of retaliatory investigations into Biden administration officials, maybe in an attempt to impeach some people in the Biden administration and maybe Biden himself. They promised that back in 2020. Or I guess they probably promised it back in early 2021 after Biden took over. So at any rate, the political gridlock is going to get worse from here. All this political instability, I think it's going to get worse from here. I just don't think the midterms are going to do it. If I think 2024 into January 25 and beyond, that's a massive danger zone for me. And I put that on the calendar and it kind of, it's in the back of my mind. I think, okay, you know, start making a list of, all right, what are the national effects going to be if we do have massive election problems? If we have, what's it called? Electoral, I don't know, whatever the thing is for ED, I forget what it's called. Electoral dysfunction. There we go. What happens if we have some catastrophic failure of the election? States refuse to certify the electors. There's the electoral college blows up. I don't know. Lots of stuff could happen. That's one thing. Understanding what could happen on a national strategic level. The thing that we have to do in this community is we have to start to pick out the tactical effects, the local effects. What is this? I walk out my front door. What does this do to my neighborhood? Or what does this do to my town? Or what happens at the county level? And the more we can identify these things, the more we can prepare for these specific instances. So close your eyes, put on your thinking cap, embrace your inner prepper fiction author, post-apocalyptic fiction book, and think about what this could do to your neighborhood. And then once you do that, then we can start to plan for these specific local things. And that is really, I think that's the biggest thing anyone can do in preparedness. We talk about food, water, and batteries and solar panels and fire starters and compasses and 70-pound bug out bags, all this other stuff. If you don't understand the local impacts of these national level events, I really have to question how prepared you are. Because if you're not identifying these local effects, then you're probably not looking over them and probably not preparing for them. All right. Let's get back to the notes here. Interestingly, the CCP spokesdude, he's actually his name is Zhao Lijian, and yesterday he alluded to the United States being the quote unquote top arsonist, and basically the U.S. goes around setting fires, and he is not technically wrong. The United States government does cause a lot of problems, and My picture of Russia, Ukraine is that the United States, the Biden administration, did not do all they could do to prevent war. I think we can make some probably logical, rational inferences from that. And the U.S. basically slept walked Ukraine into war. That's my takeaway here. At any rate, they're using this China. We'll get to this Chinese press conference that was, overnight our time, in just a minute. But they're using this whole thing, Russia, Ukraine, to peel away international support from the United States to try to chip these countries off of this U.S.-led sanctions campaign. And I talked about yesterday China's new strategic message. Everything that's wrong in the world this year, we can blame on U.S. sanctions against Russia. We'll get into that a little bit more. One word on BRICS, because I was doing some more research this morning, and last week there was a ministerial level meeting from these BRICS countries. These BRICS officials met virtually, and here's what the Russian minister had to say to his fellow BRICS countries counterparts. He said, quote, "New sanctions are destroying the foundation of the existing international monetary and financial system based on the US dollar," end quote. Keep in mind, this is a strategic message, right? I mean, this is fired for effect here. He continues, "This pushes us to the need to speed up work in the following areas." So he's saying the BRICS countries need to speed up work for these areas. Quote, "The use of national currencies for export-import operations, the integration of payment systems and cards, and our own financial messaging system, and the creation of an independent BRICS rating agency," end quote. Yesterday, I talked about how China was trying to lead the BRICS into developing this new world order. Well, let's just take a cursory glance at what the Russians are calling for here in the BRICS. And this doesn't mean that the Brazilians and Indians are going to go along with it. It's very interesting, though, because this is what Russia and China is pushing. So the use of national currencies for import-export operations for bilateral trade, which means getting away from the dollar, accepting each other's currencies, basically have a potentially a BRICS basket. This is, I'm just kind of spitballing here. I don't think a BRICS basket is the most likely potential, but that's where we could be going with this. Or a basket of commodities-based currencies. Russia now says the rubles based on back to the gold standard, or whatever. So that's the first thing. Integration of payment systems, our own financial messaging system. That's going to replace. They want the BRICS version of SWIFT. That's also going to impact the United States, and the creation of an independent BRICS rating agency. Fitch and S&P Global and the other international rating agencies, I think there's only 3 or 4 of them, maybe predominantly, they want to build their own so that they have control. Because one thing that the Chinese and Russians certainly suspect is that the Fitch and S&P Global, and there's whatever ratings agency. Hang on one second. Let me look these up just 2 seconds here. What they do is they go in. Oh yeah, Moody's, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. They're the top 3. So, and they suspect that they are influenced by the U.S. government. They're influenced by U.S. foreign policy. They're influenced by the West. And so they want to have their own ratings agency so they can, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see their ratings on U.S. credit worthiness. All right, enough about that. That's what's happening at these ministerial conferences here. You should know about it. This is like a slow-moving train wreck here. Let's jump into quickly producer price index that came out this morning. I've got a question. So listen, I'm going to talk about CPI, which they say is annualized rate of 8.5%. That's basically consumer price index is 8.5% higher than it was 1 year ago. And I know real inflation is probably closer to 15 to 20%. I get that. But as long as we use the same CPI number, then we should have, as long as the equation doesn't change, we should be able to measure accurately month over month and year over year, right? It's like if you have a tape measure that's instead of 12 inches, it says 15 inches. Well, you can, at any rate, that's probably a bad analogy here. All right. The producer price index came in this morning at 11.2%, and that accelerated from 10% last year. And so the question I have next is if producer price index, that measurement measures input costs and for producers, increased production costs by producers go into finished prices on finished goods, which goes on to the consumer. Ergo, when production prices go up, consumer costs go up, hence higher CPI next month. Does this mean we're hitting or getting dangerously close to 9.5%, 10% CPI, which is probably, I mean, that's going to put us probably above 20% real inflation next month? Just a question that I have. And I was talking to Troy at lunch today, and we're going to double check if the PPI is a solid leading indicator of where CPI is. We'll have a breakdown of all this stuff in tomorrow's economic early warning for Forward Observer subscribers. All right, next, let's get into this threat by Dmitry Medvedev. Dude's dropping bombs over here. So there's a pro-Russian politician. His name is Viktor Medvedchuk. And he was put on house arrest earlier this year by the Ukrainian government. And he escaped. He escaped house arrest. Allegedly, he was going for the border. He was trying to escape Ukraine. And allegedly, according to Zelensky, some Ukrainian special operation rolled this guy up, arrested him. All right. And they kind of paraded him. They put him in Ukrainian military uniform. You know, the guy's handcuffed. He's looking all disheveled. You know, this guy's a billionaire. And this is what Medvedev had to say. He said, quote, "Those freaks who call themselves the Ukrainian authorities say that they want to beat testimony out of Viktor Medvedchuk quickly and fairly, convict him, and then exchange him for prisoners." So according to Medvedev, the Ukrainians want to convict Medvedchuk of being a pro-Russian, whatever they're going to convict him of, and try to swap him for Ukrainian prisoners of war held on the other side. But Medvedev continues, quote, "These people should watch out and lock the doors well at night to make sure they do not become the people who are going to be exchanged themselves." Essentially a threat saying the people who are conspiring against Medvedchuk might want to watch out because they may be getting arrested and pucked next by the Russians. So I don't know how likely this is, but I don't think Russia is going to de-escalate from here based on comments like that. Now, let's move on to the next thing, global NATO. So in today's early warning report, we had two things about NATO operations expanding into the Indo-Pacific. You might think to yourself, wow, that's odd. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization expanding into the Indian and Pacific Oceans. We call it the military command used to be PACOM, Pacific Command. Now it's Indo-PACOM because we've added the Indo on there, the Indian Ocean area. Yesterday, a senior NATO official, I think he's actually the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, was in South Korea meeting with South Korean military officials to discuss increased military interoperability between NATO and South Korea. And there are people in the United States who swear up and down that global NATO doesn't exist. It's one of those Washington Post fact checks. They say, well, Mike says global NATO, but we say that's wrong on the fact check because there is no such thing as global NATO. Yes, there's no such organization, quote unquote, as global NATO. However, there are increasing military alliances like with South Korea and Japan. And actually, there's a question in this Chinese Foreign Ministry press conference today about Japan joining the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia in this advanced weapons research pact that was announced, a week or two ago? So at any rate, this opens to global NATO is this concept that NATO just doesn't exist in the North Atlantic. They're talking about, Brazil, for instance, is a major non-NATO ally. Colombia, for instance, is a major. In June, Biden's going to announce this at the Summit of the Americas, which is in Los Angeles in June. He's going to say Colombia is now officially a major non-NATO ally. South Korea, Japan, so on and so forth. Excuse me, so on and so forth. Major non-NATO allies. That's global NATO. All right, that is the uh, that's. I just can't imagine how NATO is going to get involved in Indo-Pacific. But I think this is also a good indicator of how concerned these Western countries are, uh, how much they want to contain China and contain the Chinese military, contain Chinese influence. And when we talk about the bifurcation of the world, this is exactly what we're talking about. The world breaking down, just like it did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, breaking down into US/Western spheres of influence and Soviet spheres of influence. But only now it's going to be the Chinese sphere of influence. We are in Cold War 2.0. As much as the Chinese say that we're not, and as much as the Chinese say the United States is the one pressing Cold War 2.0, we'll talk about that. Let's go ahead and open up for some questions. I got one more point I want to make here. Let's jump into this China. So this guy, he's a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson. He answers a lot of questions from Chinese state media. Dude's name is Zhao Lijian, and he gives us press conference every day. And for the past several weeks, I've been reading the transcripts of the press conferences because he says a lot of interesting things about what's going on in the world. A lot of the stuff's not picked up by American news. Imagine that. By the way, if you want a daily rundown of these press conferences, let me know in the comments or via email or via social media, because I can talk about the significant stuff on this show, and we can just make that kind of like a semi-daily recurring segment on the show. So today, a reporter from Chinese state media asked Zhao about a U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency report, and here's specifically what he asked, or here's specifically what that DIA report says. They say that China, quote, owns and operates about half the world's ISR systems. ISR is an acronym: intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. They're talking about mainly satellites. China owns and operates about half the world's ISR systems, most of which could support monitoring, tracking, and targeting of U.S. and allied forces worldwide, especially throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And the reporter asked, what is China's response? And here's what Zhao had to say. Quote, the United States, has been weaving a narrative about the so-called threat posed by China and Russia in outer space in an attempt to justify its own military buildup to seek space hegemony. End quote. Now, this is, China always deflects on this. They always accuse the United States of trying to weaponize space. And actually, let me finish the sentence. Zhao says, quote, it is just another illustration of how the U.S. clings on to the Cold War mentality and deflects responsibility. Here's the thing. China has been waging a Cold War against the United States probably for 40 years. I remember being in high school in like the late 90s, and my dad reading a book about rising China and telling me to go read these Bill Gertz articles, because Bill Gertz has been talking about the rise of China for decades. And so it's not like this stuff is a surprise. It's not like it hasn't been happening. We've known about this since the 90s. China watchers have known about it for probably a decade before then. Really putting the pieces together that, yeah, actually China's going to be a rising power. And yeah, they're building up their military. And yeah, their production capacity is pretty much unparalleled. The rate and the rate at which and the volume of military hardware, like ships and submarines that they're churning out of. Don't quote me on this. I seem to recall, I'll have to go back and look at this. I want to say that China is going to have like as many attack submarines in like another 5 or 10 years as we do ships in the U.S. in the entire U.S. Navy. That doesn't exactly sound right, but it was something staggering like that. I'll have to go back and look up the exact thing. So at any rate, yeah, he said, let's see. Oh yeah, so he accuses the Chinese continue all the time. They accuse the war. They accuse the United States of engaging in this Cold War. I actually think the United States has been slow to respond to the Chinese Cold War. I mean, we had back during Obama, we're even I was looking at reading like these press releases from the Department of Justice. Oh, another Chinese national got arrested for espionage. Oh, another Chinese, cyber attack, stole a bunch of data. There's the OPM hack, Office Personnel Management, and all these veterans, myself included, got these forms about saying, hey, your identity's been stolen. It didn't say by the Chinese, but it was by China. And here's 6 months free of credit reporting or something stupid like that. So we've known about this for years and years, and the U.S. has just been extraordinarily slow to respond to this. I hate to say rapidly rising threat, but it absolutely is. At any rate, Jaw continues about. He says that the United States has named space as a warfighting domain, and the U.S. government has been accelerating efforts to build a space force and space command. And even that was only several years ago. So the U.S. has been absolutely slow to respond to this Chinese Cold War. Zhao is then asked about Japan. So apparently the government of Japan last year at some point in time approved discharging water from the Fukushima nuclear plant. They say it's been treated and denuclearized or whatever. And they've been discharging this water into the ocean. And so the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson is asked about it. By the way, the Japanese government says it's safe. It's been treated. But the Chinese spokesperson cites all the domestic and international pressure that's building up against the Japanese government. They want this to stop. He's then asked about food security. By the way, if you think Biden and Obama got served up softballs, this Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesdude gets the creamiest of cream puffs imaginable. And all of these, it seems like almost all these questions are served up so perfectly that this spokesperson just gets to talk. He gets to make his propaganda talking points every day through these questions. And that should come as no surprise because the exact same thing happens, except for the 4 years under Trump. The same exact thing happens for these most of the time for U.S. politicians. So yesterday I talked about the Chinese strategic message, which is political and financial instability, food shortages, fertilizer shortages. All this instability around the world stems directly from U.S. sanctions on Russia. And this is a way for China to shift blame away from COVID-19 and the global logistics breakdown that we've seen over the past 2 years, shift the blame over to the United States. Now the United States is to blame for all this global dysfunction. And here is what, this Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson is asked about food security. And here's what he had to say, quote, after the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out, the U.S. and its allies have imposed waves of unilateral sanctions against Russia. That's not entirely true. They were not unilateral sanctions at any rate. He continues, but instead of solving any problems, sanctions have only put a dent in the languishing world economy. You just raised food security. I noted that even the U.S. president himself had to admit, quote, the price of the sanctions is just not imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well. And that food shortage is, quote, going to be real. China is trying to build world pressure to end sanctions against Russia. Jha continues, as a major country in the world, the U.S. should also take more responsibility to defend the stability of the world economic system, along with its rules and foundation. It should not willfully ask the whole world to pay for the United States unilateral sanctions. All right. So this is probably a good place to end it. I just want to point out every single day, the Chinese media is talking about how detrimental U.S. sanctions against Russia are on the world. Here we have their main press secretary of the foreign ministry coming out and saying as much. He's asked these kinds of questions every single day. This is probably intended for Chinese audiences as much as it is for international audiences. The thing to keep an eye on, probably my top trend right now in the entire world, is what BRICS is doing, how China is leading the BRICS to defeat the rules-based international system, which I think is a joke of a term, but that's what the United States calls it. And ultimately, that's going to have a massive impact on where the American empire is headed. And again, my whole thesis is that, and it's not just my thesis. Glubb, Goldstone, Peter Turchin, all sorts of people talk about these cycles, these 250-year cycles where empires rise and decline and ultimately collapse. We are reaching the tail end. We're at the beginning of the end, I think, near the beginning of the end of the decline of the U.S. empire. The question is, does it end with a whimper or a bang? And I guess we'll leave it there. Listen, if you want to support the show, we certainly would love to have you as a Forward Observer Early Warning subscriber. You can get my show notes in addition to our morning early warning intelligence brief. You can do that at forwardobserver.com/subscribe. In the meantime, Dustin will be heading up the Daily SA show tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. right here on this channel. I'll be back on at 2 p.m. We certainly appreciate your support. Until then, be well and stay out front.